Welcome to a radical discussion of independence, free will, liberty, and the left-hand path. This is Damonosophy 2.0 with your host, Paul Frederick.
Kazimierza, skąd się wzięła ta miłość do Kazimierza? No vision can grasp.
And now it's time for more chaos. Well, I no sooner than dropped the review of the Lords of Chaos episode, and I got some feedback. I got a comment from Lord Charon on SoundCloud. Lord Charon says, "Good job reviewing the movie, Paul. Just a thought. I believe that the chaos was necessary to bring black metal into being, as big of a movement as it is today. On an individual level, yes, it only led to destruction. Just my 2 cents. Keep up the good work." So, let me say, I totally get that. And to an extent, I agree with that. I think you're right on. And this is even a theme, really, in the film. Euronymous, the character of Euronymous, basically he narrates the whole film. It's basically first person, and he's like narrating all the way through the movie, which is really neat because, you know, part of the way through, I mean, everyone's aware that he's going to die in the end. So you start wondering, how are they going to handle this narration piece? And it's really clever how they did it. Like after he dies, then he continues to narrate and said, you know, well, that's how I met my fate, and that kind of sucks. But hey, it's not so bad because now we're all famous, and I am famous because I'm the inventor of true Norwegian black metal. So it's humorous, but yeah, there's totally an acknowledgement that, well, all that chaos made us famous. All the murder, death, and destruction made us famous. And so, yes, there's some truth to that, most certainly. But, and you know, it also reminds me, just the way Lord Charon stated this, how that, and you think about that the chaos was there in the beginning. That reminds me of a line from the book Taz by Hakim Bey, who's one of the early, you know, in my opinion, one of the early, you know, writers who got like the whole chaos movement, chaos magic movement going. And he says, chaos never died. Chaos is around in the beginning. That's part of the psyche, the function of chaos. Like all creation myths, they all start out, you know, before there was creation, before there was consciousness, there was chaos. There was chaos and darkness. From chaos arises order, which means consciousness. Consciousness arises from chaos. So there's a lot to that whole idea, but getting down to the specificity of the Norwegian black metal church burning incident, you also got to keep in mind that, you know, Varg is saying the exact same thing. He's saying, without all that chaos, without me stabbing that poser in the head, you know, none of this would have happened. So, I mean, he takes credit for it. He thinks he's a great artist for having done that. And, of course, I think that is ridiculous and shitty, again. And so there's definitely an element of bullshit to that. Another thing to think about is all the other bands who basically say the same thing. You got to take this in the broader context and say this pattern of, you know, a band member dies and then the band gets big or the movement gets big. That's not an original thing. That happens all the time. Okay, yeah, you know, Stu Sutcliffe, you know, from the Beatles. You have Brian Jones with the Rolling Stones. You know, Sid Vicious. John Bonham, there's numerous examples, and this is a thing that people would talk about back in the day when I was on tour and stuff, and you know, the Electric Hellfire Club, you know, they went through a thing where the keyboardist Shane Lawson, aka Reverend Dr. Love, died, and And there's this idea out there in music that, you know, there has to be a sacrifice for someone for the band to actually make it, or the movement to actually make it. And that's an interesting theory to think about, but ultimately it's like kind of superstitious. And ultimately, I think sacrifice of any human life is like unsatanic and unleft-hand path. Crack open the good old LaVey Satanic Bible for more on that. You know, anyone who does magic, any true black magician, should be able to summon up the energy and the will and the wish within themselves without having to take the precious gift of life from another living organism unnecessarily. So that's what it is. But there's tons of other examples of this happening in music and in the history of rock. One difference is that most of them are deaths. Most of them are accidental deaths. Either Buddy Holly dying in a plane crash, or all of the drug overdoses, Hendrix and Janis Joplin, et cetera, et cetera. One exception is Sid Vicious was also a possible murder, and that's what makes the black metal stuff different. Is it wasn't a suicide, it wasn't an accidental death, it was a very intentional, violent, brutal murder. So it's even beyond Sid Vicious in that respect, because it was always a question with Sid Vicious. Sid said that he didn't stab Nancy Spungen, it was the people next door. It's kind of unbelievable, though, and not really backed up by any evidence. And then he died before it ever went to trial. So a lot of people assumed that Sid just stabbed her in an angry fight, which they had lots of times when they were jonesing for heroin. And that's very possible, and that's how they portrayed that in the movie Sid and Nancy too. So that's another, I think, the only other example from the rock annals. I'm not sure how you pronounce that. History, where there was a murder rather than a suicide. But in the Sid case, it's a possible accidental murder, and she only got stabbed once, not like Varb stabbed Euronymous like 30 times in the back and twice in the head after driving, 2 hours with his knife. So, I mean, it's pretty different and unique in that sense. The thing is that, chaos, when you take chaos as itself, and you look at it from the realm of Western philosophy. And don't get me wrong, I'm a chaos fan. Okay, I like Lieber Nolan's Psychonaut. I think that's one of the best books on magic out there, and sigilizing is one of the most effective occult systems out there. But if you take chaos, the idea of chaos chaos used as a philosophy, which chaos magic is probably really the only example of chaos utilized as a philosophy. Although some people say some elements of Taoism partake of chaos, but I would argue it's not at all in the same camp. This really, if you take all of this and you put it in the realm, analyze it from the perspective of Western philosophy, and there is no ideology or system or school of thought that exists in the world that cannot be analyzed from the perspective of Western philosophy, and in particular, the ideas of Plato, Aristotle, and Kant. And I think any philosophy professor would verify this. And also the great philosopher Leonard Peikoff wrote a book about this called The Dim Hypothesis, where he talks about three modes. An integrated mode developed by Aristotle, a misintegrated mode, which traces to Plato. Misintegrated, and these terms are in reference basically to the soul of man in relation to the universe, because that's what philosophy talks about. It talks about what the universe is and then what is man's relation to that stuff. And Aristotle's system integrates man with the real world. Plato misintegrates man with the real world by illustrating a world that is metaphysically composed of a material universe and then a non-material ideological ideal universe. And then there's the disintegrated mode, which is traceable to Kant, which holds that the real world is unknowable. It is absolutely unknowable by us, and therefore, in some sense, doesn't really exist. Plato says, no, there is a real world, but we just can't see it. And if we make lots of efforts and we find, wise people, philosopher kings to guide us, then we can see the real world. And that's the basis for a lot of religious systems have the basis of that. And then the Aristotelian mode, integrated mode, holds that man is integrated with the universe, and you can see the universe as it is. You can see yourself as you really are, and you can see the real world that you live in, and you can carve out your own place for it. And Anton LaVey's brand of Satanism very much fits into that integrated mode as an example for that. The Kantian mode, the disintegrated mode, this is where chaos magic exists, because the idea in the Kantian mode is that since you cannot perceive reality as it is, since it's not even possible, then really a lot of things don't matter. Maybe just like, pleasure seeking matters, but then even that doesn't matter because everything's kind of transient. And there's a lot of variations on this. But ultimately, that's where chaos falls. Also, incidentally, postmodernism and many of the ideologies that are in line with that also would fall into this realm of the disintegrated Kantian mode. And if you read, Derrida, postmodernism, if you look into that enough, you're going to find references to Kant. So this isn't just made up. You can actually trace back the influences in these systems pretty clearly to these philosophers. So, all that being said, that is where chaos falls. That is where also nihilism falls. The whole system of nihilism. And this is where the idea of nihilism comes from. It comes from the Kantian mode of perceiving the universe. So what is nihilism about? Well, it's like nothing ever goes anywhere, and so why bother? And this is, also the basis of existentialism. Most existentialist movements fall into this category as well. So that's where chaos falls as a philosophy. That's where that's where black metal falls as a form of music. Now it's an interesting thing to try and fit music into these kinds of structures. And I want to say Leonard Peikoff, in his book, The Dim Hypothesis, he stayed away from music. He talks about art and philosophy and literature and political systems, how they all fall into these three modes. But as I recall, he really specifically avoids music. Part of the reason being, he said, I don't know music that well, and that's just too big of a weird thing. So, right away I can go back to, say, something like Bach. That's probably in the Platonic mode, because there's a very due to the spiritual transcendent nature of it, the reliance on masters. Only certain masters really do music in that system, so maybe the classical music falls in there. Maybe folk music might fall into the integrated Aristotelian mode, because it's done by people who are ordinary people. It's generally about real life concerns. And then a lot of certainly black metal, I would say, that falls into the Kantian mode. So I guess I am kind of trying to fit music into the dim hypothesis model now, even though I didn't really set out to do that. But I would say chaos magic falls into that mode. Certainly, noise music, experimental, industrial, a la Throbbing Gristle and things like that would fall into the disintegrated Kantian mode, and they're all also very chaotic. So I could see that being in there. And again, I'm not saying don't listen to the music. I'm not saying don't listen to the music. It's just music. That's what I'm saying, is to realize it's just music. Don't become a slave to it and dedicate your life to it, to any form of music, really. I mean, the function of music in your life is to enjoy it at certain times. Let yourself get lost in it for a moment, lost in the rhythm and the vibe and the feel of it. But you don't want to become a slave to it. And, this was my point in relation to chaos and black metal, is there's the examples of people who did make themselves slaves to it, and it literally led them down a path of chaos and nihilism and eventually self-destruction. So that's all I'm saying about it, is that you have to take a conscious role in the influences that are going into your head, and you have to understand that you are the master. You are the causal force. You are the one who decides what you're going to enjoy, what you're going to consume in terms of impressions. And that if you take nothing in other than shit, then all you're going to be able to produce in the world around you is shit. It's just the basis of magic. It's just the basis of magic, people. If you want to produce wine rather than grape juice, then you need to take in a higher substance, and you need to do something creative with it, rather than just taking in the shitty substances and more shitty substances and more and more and more. You just need to not be a slave to it all. That's all I'm saying. And yeah, chaos is there. I know chaos is there. And we all, you see, one of the things that we talk about, so you don't want to fully give yourself to chaos, and at the same time, you can't entirely exclude chaos, because chaos is just, the randomness of the universe around us. So you can't totally exclude yourself from it either. But what you have to do is determine your relationship with chaos. Determine your relationship, and just acknowledging that you have a relationship with chaos is a step in that direction. So the writer Nassim Nicholas Taleb, who wrote the very excellent book Fooled by Randomness, and talks a lot about the different cognitive biases. In many ways, I think Nassim is responsible for this term cognitive bias getting so ingrained in our culture. And there are some, I have some issues with it, which maybe I'll talk about in another podcast, not with cognitive bias, but with how people use this term. But before I fall down a rabbit hole with that, he talks about risk tolerance, and all investors, economists talk about risk tolerance. And if you want to get into investing, that's one of the first things that you have to do, is you have to determine your own risk tolerance. Can you deal with a lot of risk, or do you not like a lot of risk? Does too much risk make you nervous and stressed out? And everyone has to decide that. Anyone who's going to invest has to decide that for themselves. So it's the same way with magic, that you have to understand your chaos tolerance. And actually, it's the same thing with anything in life. You have to understand your risk tolerance. You have to understand your chaos tolerance. So how far are you willing to risk what you have, or how far do you feel the need to, as some have said, manage your downside, right? To make things confident. Like when people like read tarot cards, they look at the Tower card and they like to talk about, well, the Tower, one of the things that this card means is that you have to build a stable foundation, or else whatever you build on top of it, the tower you build on top of it is going to be rickety. It might be subject to chaos and might fall down if your foundation isn't strong enough. And all this is a metaphor for how you build yourself in terms of risk tolerance. Do you need a really strong base, or are you okay with like not so strong of a base? Can you stand the idea of rolling with the punches a little bit more? And I'm not saying, conservatism or liberalism in regard to your risk tolerance is better or worse, or one way is better, but that everyone in the process of self-analysis and in becoming a more super substantial being, a more solid individual, has to go through their own process of determining their own risk tolerance, of determining your own relationship to chaos. And none of these guys who are in the black metal thing did that, obviously. They just gave themselves over to it. And I mean, that could be like a phase of youth that people go through where chaos is a little more prominent. I think everyone goes through that. You feel like you're going to live forever. You're going to live forever. You're going to be a star one day. You just know it for sure. You're not worried about, if you're ever going to have to pay the bills or anything like that. And it's a lot easier to get pulled into chaos at that age. That's why, all these crazy suicides and deaths happen to people, in this age category, from late teens to, early 20s or something like that. So anyhow, that's it. That's enough for Chaos Revisited. Everyone, my suggestion is spend some time thinking about chaos and what your relationship to chaos is, what your risk tolerance is in relation to the world around you. If you just spend a little bit of time doing that, you'll be a little bit better armed to go out there and keep those dark fires burning.